All right, so this is lesson 3, and today we're going to be talking about understanding trauma. You have what we're going to be covering in front of you, and hopefully in a minute or so we should have some PowerPoints that'll go along and help us with this. And so this comes right out of the Hands That Heal curriculum, and so I want to make sure that that you have this. So in order to understand the trauma of transition for a victim of sexual slavery to a life of freedom through the restorative caregiving, caregivers must consider the cultural differences among the diverse communities of the survivor's life. Now, first thing I kind of want to identify is what is culture. Okay, and a lot of times I think we think of culture in terms of ethnicity, and certainly there is some of that. We think of culture in terms of ethnicity, but really it's not. Okay, culture has to do with the belief of a group of individuals. Now, we as Christians, there is a Christian culture. There are certain things that we hold to as valuable. There are certain things that we hold to as that's part of being a Christian. When we define what a Christian is, there are certain things that define the Christian culture, and those things are common to us as Christians. It's amazing how you could have Christians in a room that are of various backgrounds and various ethnicity, right? We all look different, but yet we have such a commonality in our faith. You know, brothers and sisters in the Lord might look and behave very differently, and yet in some things we're very much the same because we hold those certain things sacred. So in the same way, we have to look at our society. In our society, there are many different cultures. Some of them are made up from ethnical things, but and then you can look at, for example, the hip hop culture, where there's young people who come around a style of music, and it includes the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they act, and things that they're into. So culture is a very powerful thing. It's something that influences everyone. There is a culture of the world versus the culture of the church. Certainly, people who are affluent, right? There's a culture, even in that, of affluence. And so these are all things that we need to be considering when we're using these terms. So I don't want us to confuse culture here with ethnicity, because it is a very different thing. There are vast differences among the people that we're ministering to. There is a culture around sex trafficking. There is a culture that comes along with that. There are behaviors that are acceptable to people who are sexually trafficked and involved in these type of lifestyles. There is things that are normal, if you will, to them, that are very abnormal to us normal people. Okay, and so we have to understand that the culture decides what's normal. Okay, the culture is what dictates what normalcy is. So when we say to one of these people, that's not normal, or that we're normal, we have to understand that in their world, in their culture, that's not normal. Some of the things that we do is not normal. And so we'll get more into that as we move forward. So caregivers must consider the cultural differences among the diverse communities of the survivor's life. They have their community of origin. Then there's the sex industry. And now we're placing them into this aftercare program. And all of these have different, varied cultures. Okay? So this session will help identify the transitional trauma that occurs in leaving the sex industry and in adjusting to the aftercare program. So just because it's better for them that they are here does not mean that it's any less traumatic for them. Just because it's a good situation that they're here, thank you, brother, does not mean that that it's still not so different from what they were involved in. I want to make sure that my phone is off. Okay. That it does not produce trauma. Because even a good change is still a change. You know what I'm saying? Even a good turnaround is still a turnaround and comes with it those things. So there are important definitions and terms that we want to keep in mind in this session. Number one is trauma. Okay, and trauma is defined as the debilitating effect of an event or an experience on an individual. Though it denotes a single event and its aftermath, child and adult victims of sex trafficking frequently have lived in a continuous state of trauma. So trauma can, according to this definition, be something that comes on suddenly, all right? And that's usually how we think of it. You know, somebody goes through a traumatic event, one experience in their life. You know, we hear about post-traumatic stress disorder, where young men and women who go off to war are impacted by the war, and the war just messes with their mind. The first time they see somebody die, the first time they see, you know, blood, you know, in that kind of way, explosions, and you know, their life is put in jeopardy, and there's this chaotic surroundings. And so when we think about trauma, we generally think about some sort of one-time big event that happens that causes trauma. And even we see, like in inner cities, or you know, where people are growing up and they see these kind of violent acts, or a child who grows up and maybe there's domestic violence in the home. So all of these things are traumatic events. But then there's also ongoing traumatic events. Okay? The way that you might deal with a singular event, seeing someone, you know, die in front of you, seeing some horrible accident perhaps, and those things, they affect you. But then can you imagine an ongoing traumatic event where, okay, now I'm taken out of my family and I'm sex trafficked, but now for 2, 3, 4 years I'm going through this, you know, traumatic occurrence. And the same way goes with bringing them here. The trauma, certainly initially there's trauma, but then there's ongoing trauma as we begin to try and minister and help these people deal with some of the stuff that they've had to live with. And in many cases, they're reliving it. Part of the healing process is reliving what you had already gone through. And when you begin to relive it, sometimes it can cause almost as much trauma as actually going through it in the first place. So we have to be careful and understand that even though it's a healing process, and even though it's better being here than it would be out there, nevertheless, there's still trauma attached to what they're going through here. Transition, number 2 there, is the process of a period of changing from one state of or condition to another. Okay? So transition from being here to there, and transition brings trauma with it. Any change is a crisis. Okay? And crisis brings with it all types of feelings and emotions. And the way that people deal with transition, the way that people deal with crisis, the way that people deal with trauma is as varied as there are people. We all deal with it differently. Some people deal pretty well with it. Some people actually thrive in it. Weird people, strange people, people that work at the Dream Center, you know. But most people don't deal with that well. Most people are creatures of habit. They like to control their environment. There's a certain amount of safety and comfort and stability, right? When we control our environment. You know, when my week pretty much looks the same every day. When, you know, and you look at, if you'll notice, and you go to church, and just kind of, and you go to the same church for a while, you'll notice most of the time people will sit in the same places. They'll sit. A lot of times they'll park their cars in the same parking space. Why? Because we're creatures of habit. You know, they like, there's just something comfortable about being in that same way. And it, you know, and for some people, if you make them move, you cause trauma in their life.
That's true.
You know? There's some old people in some churches, I paid for that pew, son. You better, before you was born, I was in that pew, you know. So people are creatures of habit, and when we interfere with their habits, people become flustered. Yeah, you're interfering in their personal space. So we have to understand that that's all a part of transition. Number 3, the purchasers of sex acts or Johns. So this is one of the terms that we need to understand. Johns is used to talk about scuzzy men who pick up women or who use or purchase women for sexual acts. Okay. And terms such as red light district, brothel owners, and pimps may have different implications in various cultures and geographical settings. So during this lesson, this session, participants will compare and contrast the various communities that influence the survivor's life, identify the stressors in transition, and discover ways in which the caregiver can minimize the trauma and facilitate the survivor's transition from a life of sexual slavery to a life of independent living. So these are our goals for today's class. But this is a true story concerning the prostitution that happens in India. All right. For thousands of years, prostitution has existed in Indian society. Kings and rajas forced women to dance in their courts and to live in their harems. Priests and worshippers forced their women to perform sexual acts in the temples. Enterprising businessmen then redistributed the women and forced them to service European colonial troops and merchants in red light areas surrounding major cities. India has a long history of using women as sexual commodities. Today, this shameful legacy is evident in many red light districts scattered in and around India's major cities. Hidden within residential and shopping areas, these districts share the same buildings and lanes with tea vendors, restaurants, and other small shops. These areas seem normal until late afternoon, when scores of men begin to walk their specific doors, or to lines of women standing alone along the lanes. In some cities, the Dalalas, local mafia crime lords, control the sex industry. They ensure the availability of women and children to entertain the men who wish to purchase sex acts. The women and children live and work in a dimly lit, poorly ventilated building called a brothel. The brothels have a large